In today's presentation, we'll show how to install the differential, axle, and steering knuckle. Place the axle housing on a workbench. Apply a 1/4 inch wide bead of gear oil compatible RTV sealant to the axle housing as shown. Be sure to apply sealant around the bolt holes as well. Place the differential on the axle housing, align the holes, and install the bolts. Snug each bolt using a 12 mm socket. Then torque the bolts in an increasingly tighter crisscross pattern until 30 foot-pounds is reached. Secure the front axle housing in a vise or some other suitable workstation. Next, we'll install the axle seal. This is done by selecting a socket that is a little larger than the seal. Place the seal squarely in the axle housing. Then drive the seal into place using the selected socket and a hammer until it's flush with the machine surface. Apply a good quality grease to the axle seal. Place the knuckle pad over the knuckle ball. Then place the seal over the knuckle ball with this side of the seal oriented toward you. Install the upper kingpin bearing race by placing it squarely in the knuckle ball as shown. Using an impact socket that is a little larger than the outside diameter of the race, drive the race into place until it seats in the bottom of the cavity. Be sure the race is seated all the way in the bottom of the cavity. Flip the housing over and install the bottom kingpin bearing race in the same way. Next, we'll get the axle ready for installation. Fill a plastic bag with a softball size amount of a good quality bearing grease. Work the grease to one corner of the bag. Place the Berfield joint in a vise as shown. Cut the corner of the bag, leaving about a nickel-size hole for the grease to come out. Insert the cut corner into the opening of the Berfield and force the grease down into the joint until the grease works its way up around the balls. Install the snap ring in the axle groove. Place the axle in the Berfield joint and push down sharply until it snaps into place. Check to see that it's locked by lifting up on the axle. It should not pull out. Apply extra grease around the Berfield. The axle is now ready for installation. Place the axle housing back in the vise. Install the axle, being careful not to damage the axle seal. Align the axle splines with the differential side gears by rotating the axle, pushing inward, and moving the axle up and down. This sometimes takes some patience and persistence, but keep working at it, it will fit. Once the splines are engaged in the differential side gear, continue rotating the Berfield, moving it up and down until it drops into the knuckle ball. Double check to see that the axle is installed properly by turning the differential pinion flange and observing the corresponding movement of the axle. Next, we'll install the steering knuckle. Begin by packing the upper kingpin bearing. This is done by putting a golf ball size amount of grease in the palm of your hand and working the grease into the bearing cage by taking small bites out of the blob of grease. Once grease is observed coming out of the top of the cage, rotate the bearing and continue packing all the way around the bearing until the cage is completely full. Once the cage is full, apply as much grease on the outside of the bearing as possible. Then place the upper bearing in the race. Then pack the lower bearing in the same way as shown on the upper bearing. While holding the lower bearing in place with one hand, position the steering knuckle on the knuckle ball. Now for a little background information. The steering knuckle has to have a certain amount of preload or resistance to side-to-side movement in order to work properly. The correct amount of preload or side-to-side resistance for a Samurai steering knuckle is 2 to 4 pounds. Since this axle assembly is going to be used in an extreme off-road situation, we'll set this one at 4 pounds preload. Preload is adjusted by increasing or decreasing shim thickness. To decrease preload, shim thickness is increased. To increase preload, shim thickness is decreased. Shims are available in either 4 thousandths or 20 thousandths thicknesses and can be used in any combination to achieve the desired thickness. Our recommendation is to start this preload adjustment procedure by installing the exact same size shims that were removed during the teardown procedure. Then, if further adjustment is needed, you can increase or decrease shim thickness. So we'll begin by putting a 20 thousandths shim on the top and a 20 thousandths shim on the bottom. It's usually best to keep the shim thicknesses equal top to bottom so that the axle remains centered in the housing. Be sure that the kingpin engages the bearing properly and install the bolts. Then install a 20 thousandths shim on the bottom following the same procedure as shown on the top. Snug the upper kingpin bolts using a 12mm socket. It's a good idea to swing the knuckle back and forth during the process of tightening the kingpin bolts to be sure there's no binding, which could result in damage to the bearings. Once both kingpin bearing caps are snug, torque them in an increasingly tighter crisscross pattern until 18 foot-pounds is reached. Be sure to swing the knuckle back and forth periodically during the torquing procedure to ensure that the bearings are moving freely and not being damaged. Once both kingpin caps are torqued, measure the amount of force required to begin knuckle movement. In our example, bearing preload measured 4 pounds. So we're finished with this procedure. But remember, to increase preload, you would decrease shim thickness. To decrease preload, you would increase shim thickness. Also, be aware that preload is measured without the steering knuckle cover, pad, oil seal, or retainer in place. Additionally, the steering spindle is not installed either. The steering knuckle must be free to move without the increased resistance introduced by other installed parts. That concludes today's presentation. If ever we can help you with any of your off-road needs, simply log on to www.lowrangeoffroad.com or give us a call at 801-805-6644.